The city shimmered beneath her like a restless sea of lights, endless, glittering, and cold. From the 31st floor, Elena Brooks could see all of downtown Chicago unfolding in silent perfection. The skyscrapers looked like glass spears piercing the night sky, and somewhere in the distance, Lake Michigan reflected the moonlight in long, trembling streaks of silver. Her reflection hovered on the window pane, tall, graceful, contained, yet something in her eyes looked hollow, like a candle burning behind tinted glass. The apartment around her was immaculate, every object carefully placed. The pale marble counters, the champagne flutes on the table, the white roses in a crystal vase. The kind of beauty that photographs well but feels strangely lifeless when you're the one standing in it. Tonight was supposed to be their anniversary. 8 years of marriage, 8 years of curated smiles and diplomatic silences. Ryan had sent her a message that afternoon. Running late, don't wait up. And that was all. The message, like most of his words lately, had been efficient, polite, and completely empty. Elena stood barefoot on the cool floor, her silk dress brushing her knees, her hair still pinned from the dinner that never happened. The city hummed below, that low, mechanical rhythm of traffic and nightlife she used to love when she was younger. Back when she believed that success, love, and beauty would be enough to fill her life. But now the hum only reminded her of what was missing. On the counter, 2 champagne glasses waited, one half full, the other untouched. The bubbles had gone flat hours ago. She'd poured them anyway, a small ritual she couldn't quite give up. Her grandmother used to say that rituals kept loneliness from sinking its teeth too deep. But this one had stopped working a long time ago. Elena brushed her fingers over the rim of the glass. A faint chime rang out, fragile and sad. She could still remember the woman she used to be, the one who believed in grand beginnings. A 28-year-old creative designer who met a charming, ambitious architect at a gallery opening. Ryan Caldwell had been magnetic then, blue-eyed, eloquent, a man who seemed to carry confidence like a tailored suit. He'd made her feel seen, chosen, extraordinary. He used to say she made every room brighter. He used to hold her like he was proud. But somewhere between promotions and projects, something changed. The laughter between them became thin. Conversations turned into negotiations. He started correcting her tone in public, started using the word reasonable whenever she expressed what she wanted. She began to measure her words carefully, the way she measured color palettes at work. Nothing too sharp, nothing too bold, nothing that would disrupt his composure. That was how invisibility began, not all at once, but inch by inch. Her phone buzzed against the marble countertop. For a moment, she hoped it was him, some last-minute apology, a soft word to close the distance between them. But it was only a reminder from her calendar. Anniversary dinner, canceled. Elena exhaled softly. The small act of breathing felt heavier than it should have. The apartment lights reflected off the lake through the glass walls, turning the space into a prism of gold and blue. She wondered how something so beautiful could feel so sterile. The designer in her admired the symmetry. The woman in her felt trapped inside it. She picked up her phone and scrolled aimlessly. News headlines, design trends, travel ads. A world moving too fast for anyone to notice a woman quietly unraveling in a tower of glass. Then she saw it. A photo of her and Ryan taken last year at a charity gala. They looked perfect, her in a black gown, his hand resting on her back, both smiling for the camera. Looking at it now, she realized how rehearsed that smile had been, how his hand had rested there out of habit, not affection. She shut the phone off. Silence. And in that silence, Elena felt the faintest echo of a thought she'd buried long ago. What if this isn't love anymore? She'd always been afraid to ask that question, afraid that speaking it aloud might make it real. But tonight, surrounded by glass walls and flickering city lights, the question hung in the air like smoke. She poured out both glasses of champagne into the sink, listening to the faint hiss as the bubbles died. Then she looked at her own reflection again, the woman who had built her life around someone else's rhythm, the woman who'd become a supporting character in her own story. Something inside her stirred, small but undeniable, a whisper beneath the exhaustion. Not like this, not forever. Outside, thunder rolled faintly over the lake, the kind of slow, distant sound that promised rain. Elena walked to the window, pressed her palm against the cool glass, and watched as the first droplets blurred the city lights. Each one fractured the reflection of her face, scattering her image into countless tiny versions. 1,000 Elenas staring back. Maybe one of them, she thought, still knew how to begin again. And though she didn't realize it yet, that thought, quiet, defiant, was the first crack in the shell of her old life. The storm began softly. So did her awakening. If this moment lingered with you, if you felt her silence, her quiet ache, her yearning for something more, stay with us. There's more to her story than heartbreak. More to come about rediscovering the woman she once was. The rain had stopped before dawn, leaving a thin sheen on the city like glass polished by sorrow. When Elena woke, light pressed softly through the curtains, that muted winter light Chicago kept for mornings after sleepless nights. Her head ached from too much thinking, not enough dreaming. She made coffee without tasting it. The aroma filled the kitchen, rich and bitter, wrapping around her like a memory of comfort she no longer felt. The floor was cold beneath her bare feet, and the silence between the walls was a kind of company, the only one she could still depend on. Ryan's side of the bed was untouched. It had been for days. He'd left for a conference in Boston, but she no longer believed his explanations. They always came smooth and plausible, threaded with professional jargon, easy to accept if she wanted to keep pretending. Pretending had been her quiet profession for too long. She sipped the coffee and looked at the clock. 8:15, the hour when Ryan usually sent his first text. Brief, efficient, polite. "Morning. Meetings all day. You good?" She would reply with something equally small. "Yes. Have a great day." They'd both mastered the art of sounding fine. Her phone buzzed. Reflex made her reach for it. She expected that usual hollow greeting. Instead, a preview glowed across the screen. "Last night was perfect. Miss you already." The name above it wasn't hers. The air left her lungs. For a second, she thought her eyes were playing tricks, that maybe it was a client message or spam. But the heart emoji sat there, red and pulsing, an impossible punctuation at the end of someone else's intimacy. Her first impulse was denial, the body's primitive defense against shattering. There must be an explanation. But even as she thought it, her hands betrayed her, trembling as they unlocked the phone. The message wasn't alone. There were dozens. A river of words flowing back weeks, maybe months. Sentences that belonged to another world. Playful, tender, possessive. "You smell like spring. I can still taste the wine on your lips. You looked amazing in that black dress." And his replies, her husband's replies. "You're trouble, Sabrina. Can't stop thinking about you. Don't text me after midnight. She's light sleeper." The words burned her fingertips. She scrolled further, deeper, even when every instinct screamed to stop. She couldn't. Curiosity and heartbreak were the same creature, both hungry, both cruel. Photos appeared next, the woman's hand on his chest, her smile angled toward the camera, the faint glimpse of the cufflinks Elena had given him on their 5th anniversary. Elena's vision blurred. The phone slipped from her fingers and hit the counter with a sharp crack. She pressed both hands against the edge to steady herself. The truth had a sound, she thought, not thunder or shouting, but the quiet collapse of something once whole. For a long moment, she stood motionless, staring at the dark surface of her coffee, watching the steam twist and vanish. Her heart was still beating, though she couldn't understand why. Everything inside her had stopped. Then she saw it, a small icon on the screen, the shape of a speaker, a voice message, sent 3 nights ago. She hesitated, knowing she shouldn't, but curiosity slid its cold hand over hers. She pressed play. Static laughter. The murmur of a bar, glasses clinking, a low masculine voice, Ryan's, slightly slurred but unmistakable. "Elena? Come on, man. She's fine. She's comfortable. You don't notice her unless she's gone, you know? Like furniture." Laughter from someone else. Then Ryan again. "She's safe. Predictable. God, I sound awful, but it's true. Sabrina's just alive. She makes me feel 20 again." Elena's hand went to her mouth. The sound of her own heartbeat filled her ears. He'd said she was furniture, a part of the room, convenient, invisible. The voice kept going. cruel in its casual tone, but she didn't hear the rest. She pressed stop, set the phone down gently, almost lovingly, as if it were capable of feeling shame. Then she walked to the window. The skyline looked the same as always, glittering and heartless. A city built on reinvention. Yet here she stood, motionless in a life she designed for someone else's comfort. He told her once that she made everything look effortless. Perhaps that was the problem. Her grace had become camouflage for his guilt. Her quiet had given his arrogance room to grow. She sank onto the couch, still clutching the phone. How long had she known, deep down? The late meetings, the sudden absences, the careful distance in his eyes when she spoke. Love doesn't vanish overnight. It erodes, grain by grain, until one day you find yourself standing on empty ground, wondering when the tide went out. She thought of the woman in the messages, Sabrina, young, confident, reckless enough to chase what wasn't hers. But Elena didn't hate her. She didn't even envy her. What she felt was stranger, sharper, pity, because one day that woman would hear the same tone in Ryan's voice, the quiet disdain dressed as charm, and she would learn how temporary she'd been. A streak of sunlight cut through the clouds and landed across the living room floor. It lit up the framed photograph of their wedding day on the bookshelf, her in ivory lace, him in black and gray, both of them smiling like they believed in forever. Elena walked over, lifted the frame, and stared at it for a long time. She remembered the sound of his vow. "You're the only one I'll ever want." She wondered now whether he'd meant it then, or if those words had always been another kind of performance. She placed the frame face down. It wasn't rage she felt. Not yet. Rage was too clean, too quick. What filled her instead was something quieter and more enduring. Clarity. The slow, steady recognition that her life could not continue on the same terms. That this version of her, soft, careful, endlessly forgiving, would have to end for something else to begin. She moved through the apartment as if cataloging a museum exhibit. The elegant chairs, the white orchids, the perfect lines of modern art he'd chosen. Everything spoke of him, his taste, his control, his shadow. Nothing spoke of her. That realization, strangely, did not break her. It steadied her. When the front door opened hours later and Ryan's voice called out her name, she didn't answer. She was sitting by the window, watching the clouds roll back over the lake, her phone resting on the table beside her like a silent witness. He stepped into the room, smiling that tired, charming smile she'd once found irresistible. "Hey, you're up early," he said, loosening his tie. Elena turned her head. The morning light caught her face, soft but unreadable. "Yes," she said quietly. "I didn't sleep much." And as he crossed the room toward her, still unaware that the world he'd built on her silence was beginning to crumble, Elena understood something she hadn't the night before. Love wasn't supposed to make you disappear, and she was done vanishing. Long before the lies, before the silence and the bitter coffee mornings, there had been a beginning, fragile, bright, and utterly believable. The kind of beginning that made every compromise afterward seem like a small price for love. Elena could still remember the first night she met Ryan Caldwell. It had been at a winter exhibition in the old architecture museum on Michigan Avenue, the kind of event that smelled faintly of champagne and ambition. The city was caught in a flurry of snow that night, each flake settling on her coat like a blessing. She had gone alone. She always went to those things alone. Notebook tucked under her arm, curiosity her only companion. Ryan had been standing near a model of a new urban development, surrounded by people hanging on his every word. He was handsome in that deliberate way some men are, a mixture of confidence and restraint. When she wandered close enough to hear him speak, his voice had that kind of calm authority that made you listen, even when you disagreed. She'd made an offhand comment, something about how the design, though efficient, lacked warmth. He turned, surprised and amused. "And what would you have added?" he asked. "Something imperfect," she said. "A corner that remembers it's human." He smiled, not mockingly, but with curiosity. "You're a designer, aren't you?" "Creative director," she corrected, and that was the first time he looked at her like she was more than a passing conversation. The night had unfolded like a soft promise. They'd talked about art and architecture, about how cities mirror the people who build them. He spoke about ambition, about legacy. She spoke about balance, about the spaces between things, the silence that makes music possible. He listened. That night he really listened. When he asked for her number, she said yes. Their first date was the next weekend, a walk through Millennium Park. The city glittered under thin snow, and Ryan had carried 2 coffees, handing one to her with a shy smile. "You seem like a black coffee person," he'd said, and she'd laughed because he was right. He talked about his work at Caldwell Urban Designs, about transforming neglected neighborhoods into livable art. He made it sound noble, and maybe, back then, it was. He told her he admired women who knew what they wanted, and Elena, who had built her career out of precision and quiet certainty, felt seen. With him, everything felt steady, secure, predictable in the best way. The relationship moved fast. Dinners that turned into weekends, weekends that turned into months. Within a year, he'd asked her to move in. His apartment was all clean lines and muted colors, every detail intentional. "Order keeps my head clear," he'd said. Elena had laughed and teased that he was allergic to clutter, but secretly, she liked the calm of his world. It felt safe, unshakable, the opposite of the chaotic childhood she'd known. Ryan came from privilege, old money, quiet influence, the kind of world that moved like a current just beneath the surface of ordinary life. Elena came from grit. Her mother had raised her alone in the South Side, working double shifts at the hospital. She'd fought her way through scholarships, late nights, and rejection letters to build her career. She knew how to survive storms. Ryan, she thought, was her calm after the storm. They married in a small ceremony by the lake. He wore a gray suit. She wore a gown simple enough to feel like herself. He kissed her under the soft hum of summer wind and whispered, "You're my anchor." She'd believed him. For the first 2 years, life felt like a photograph, composed, radiant, slightly unreal. They traveled to Florence, to Kyoto, to Cape Cod in the fall. He made her laugh. She loved the way he reached for her hand absent-mindedly when they crossed the street. She loved how he said her name, like a secret, like a song. But love, Elena would learn, is not only built in the moments that take your breath away. It's built in the small, ordinary ones that no one notices. And that's where the cracks began to show. It started with the little dismissals, a casual correction when she spoke in meetings he attended as her guest, a raised eyebrow when she laughed too loudly with friends. "You're too sensitive," he would say, smiling, as if the words were a joke. "Don't overthink everything." She learned not to. Then there were the choices she stopped making, which restaurant to eat at, what furniture to buy, how to spend their weekends. He had preferences, and his certainty made decision-making feel easy, even comforting. "You're better at color," he'd say. "Let me handle the structure." It sounded like partnership. It wasn't. It was erosion, slow and invisible. By their 4th anniversary, she'd begun to measure her words, her laughter, her dreams. When she received an offer to lead a new creative department in New York, she hesitated to tell him. She could still hear his voice from an old argument. "You're always chasing something. Why can't you just be satisfied?" So she turned the offer down. She told herself it was for the marriage, that love sometimes required sacrifice. But in truth, it was fear. Fear of disappointing him. Fear of being seen as too ambitious, too much. Ryan praised her loyalty. He said she was steady. It sounded like affection, but it was a quiet request for obedience. The years blurred together. Dinners with his colleagues, trips she didn't choose, photos of them smiling in places she barely remembered. Her job became her refuge. There she was still Elena Brooks, respected, admired, in control. But at home she began to fade into the decor he loved so much. One night, as they hosted a dinner party, she overheard Ryan talking to a client in the kitchen. "Elena keeps things running," he said lightly. "She's low maintenance." A blessing, really. Low maintenance. The phrase stung more than it should have. Later that night, when she tried to tell him why, he kissed her forehead and said, "You're overreacting." It was a compliment. It was always a compliment. By their 7th year, they'd stopped fighting altogether. Not because there was peace, but because she'd stopped speaking. Silence became their language. She poured her energy into perfection, the perfect home, the perfect wardrobe, the perfect wife. From the outside, their marriage looked flawless. People envied them. Colleagues said they were the couple who had it all. Inside, the air was heavy with everything unsaid. Elena often lay awake beside him, staring at the ceiling, wondering when she'd started confusing comfort with happiness. She told herself that every relationship settled eventually, that love didn't have to feel like fire to last. But sometimes, in the quiet between his breaths, she'd feel an ache, not for someone else, but for the woman she used to be. And though she didn't yet know it, that ache was the first signal of collapse. The small tremor before the fault line splits, the sound the heart makes right before it starts to wake. The change didn't arrive like thunder. It came softly, disguised as routine, folded into familiar mornings and ordinary words. Elena couldn't name the exact day the distance became unbearable. It had been growing in quiet increments, spreading through the walls of their life like a shadow that didn't need the dark to exist. Ryan began coming home later. First it was an hour, then two, then entire nights swallowed by client dinners or project deadlines. He always spoke with the measured calm of a man too reasonable to be doubted. "You know how it is," he'd say, loosening his tie, his eyes already drifting toward his phone. "If I don't show up, someone else will." She'd smile faintly, the way she always did, and murmur, "Of course." But inside, something small and wounded curled tighter. He'd changed in subtle ways. His voice had a new inflection, an energy that didn't belong to her anymore. His scent, once coffee, cedar, and the faint salt of his skin, carried traces of something floral now, something expensive and unfamiliar. The smell stayed long after he left the room, haunting the spaces between them. Dinner conversations became sparse, filled with words about contracts, clients, and investors. When she asked about his day, his replies were functional, polished, and closed. When she spoke of her own projects, his attention wandered, his fingers scrolling through his phone, nodding at intervals that didn't match her sentences. One night, she paused mid-story and said quietly, "You're not listening." Ryan didn't even look up. "Elena, not everything has to be about feelings. I'm tired." That word, tired, became his shield. He was tired when she wanted to talk, tired when she wanted affection, tired when she asked if something was wrong, and eventually, she stopped asking. The silence between them became its own kind of conversation. It said more than words ever could. She began to notice how easily he smiled when others were around. Colleagues, friends, strangers, how he could summon warmth for everyone but her, and how she, in turn, had perfected the art of pretending not to notice. Tessa, her oldest friend, saw it before she admitted it to herself. At brunch one Saturday, Tessa leaned back in her chair and said, "You're vanishing, Lena." Elena blinked. "What do you mean?" "You're editing yourself," Tessa said, eyes narrowing. "You used to fill a room. Now you apologize for taking up space." Elena forced a smile. "Marriage changes things." Tessa didn't return the smile. "Love shouldn't shrink you." The words lingered long after the conversation ended. That night, Elena lay awake in the quiet bedroom, Ryan asleep beside her, the faint glow of his phone illuminating his profile. She wondered when she had started whispering her opinions, when laughter had begun to feel like a trespass. She reached for her phone and opened their last text exchange. A dozen short, tidy messages about groceries, schedules, and errands. Not one word of tenderness, not even a simple, "I miss you." Her thumb hovered above the keyboard, but there was nothing left to say. She set it down and turned away. Days bled into weeks. Her reflection in the mirror looked the same. Elegant, composed, but something in her eyes had gone quiet. Even her work, once her refuge, began to feel like an echo of itself. She'd sit in her office, surrounded by sketches and color boards, and realize she hadn't designed anything that felt like her in months. The world saw a woman in control. Inside, she was unraveling, carefully, politely, almost beautifully. Ryan's temper had changed too, not violent but sharp. The small cruelties came disguised as logic. "You're imagining things. You're too emotional. Stop taking everything so personally." Every phrase was a correction, a gentle tightening of the leash. And Elena, still believing that love meant patience, adjusted herself to fit the shape of his disapproval. She stopped wearing the bright dresses he once adored. She learned to read his moods before speaking. She became fluent in restraint. And yet, despite everything, part of her still waited, foolishly, hopefully, for the moment he would notice the distance, the way she had learned to. But Ryan moved through life untouched by reflection. The mirror he held up to the world never faced inward. One evening, he called to say he'd be late again. She was sitting at the window, the city fading into dusk, a single candle burning beside her. The voice on the phone was distant, almost distracted. "Don't wait up," he said. "Was there ever a time I could?" she asked softly, but he had already hung up. The line went dead, and the silence afterward felt final. Later that week, she found his cufflinks on the floor near the doorway, the silver ones she'd given him their first Christmas together. She picked them up and turned them in her hand. They were slightly tarnished, like small reminders of something once precious, now neglected. She placed them in a drawer and closed it gently, as if burying something sacred, but not everything stayed buried. One afternoon, while searching for a file on their shared laptop, she noticed a folder titled Client Presentations. It wasn't the name that caught her attention. It was the date, the night of the last gala. She clicked. Inside, among diagrams and proposals, there was a photograph, candid, blurred slightly but unmistakable. Ryan, standing too close to a woman with honey-colored hair, his hand on the small of her back. The woman's face was half-turned, her expression bright, familiar. Elena closed the laptop. Her pulse thudded, slow and steady, like footsteps down a long hallway. She didn't confront him that night. She didn't shout or demand explanations. Instead, she cooked dinner, the same way she always did. Salmon, roasted vegetables, a salad neither of them would finish. When he arrived home, she smiled, listened to him talk about his day, and poured the wine. It wasn't cowardice, it was strategy. For the first time in years, she didn't feel powerless. She felt observant, awake. The air around her was sharp with realization. He had mistaken her silence for submission, but what he didn't understand was that quiet could also be preparation. When he kissed her forehead goodnight, she didn't recoil. She simply lay beside him, her mind moving like a current beneath still water. She wasn't sure what she would do yet, only that something inside her had shifted beyond repair. The woman who had built her life around someone else's certainty was beginning to remember her own. The war between them would never be loud. It would be fought in gestures, in patience, in the soft, relentless way truth fights its way to the surface. And though Ryan didn't know it yet, he was already losing. The invitation had arrived weeks earlier, embossed, elegant, and perfumed with expectation. The Caldwell Foundation Annual Charity Gala. Ryan's name printed in gold script, hers in smaller type below, as though the world already knew the hierarchy of their union. He'd told her it was important for his firm. "Investors will be there," he said, buttoning his cufflinks with the calm precision of a man arranging a chessboard. "It's good optics for us to attend together." Together. The word felt ornamental, like a decorative flourish added to a hollow design. Still, Elena had nodded. She was long past arguing over appearances. That evening, the city was a mosaic of winter lights. Their driver threaded through downtown traffic toward the art museum, where chandeliers and marble steps awaited the procession of ambition and wealth. Ryan sat beside her, scrolling through messages, his face illuminated by the blue glow of his phone. Elena gazed out the window, watching the snow begin to fall. Soft, deliberate flakes that blurred the outlines of the skyline. Her gown was deep emerald silk, the color of strength disguised as elegance. She'd chosen it for herself, not for him, and that private act of rebellion lent her a fragile power. When she caught her reflection in the car window, she almost recognized herself again. Poised, deliberate, unknowable. Inside the museum, everything shimmered. Crystal chandeliers scattered light across mirrored walls. A string quartet played something elegant and indifferent, and laughter rippled through the room like perfume. Waiters moved with synchronized grace, balancing silver trays of champagne and curated charm. Ryan's hand rested on the small of her back, firm and possessive. "Smile," he murmured. She did. They mingled. He laughed easily, shook hands, and spoke in that confident rhythm that had once seduced her. Colleagues clapped his shoulder. Investors nodded approvingly. Elena performed her role flawlessly, the gracious wife, composed and attentive, a perfect reflection of his success. But beneath her smile, a low hum of unease pulsed like static. It wasn't until later, near the center of the ballroom, that she saw her. Sabrina Lewis. The name she had read on his messages now had a face, luminous, youthful, framed by golden curls that caught the chandelier's light. She was standing beside Richard Mayer, the firm's senior partner, her laughter floating easily above the music. When she turned, Elena felt the air tighten. Sabrina's eyes found Ryan almost immediately. Recognition flickered, swift, electric, unmistakable. A heartbeat later, she composed herself, greeting him with the polished warmth of professionalism. "Ryan," she said, extending her hand. "I didn't know you'd be here tonight." Of course you did, Elena thought, but she said nothing. Ryan's expression remained perfectly neutral, his voice smooth. "Sabrina, good to see you. This is my wife, Elena." The word wife landed like a stone between them. Sabrina's smile tightened. "A pleasure," she said. Her handshake was delicate, practiced. Her perfume, light floral, matched the scent that had haunted Ryan's clothes for months. The conversation was brief, meaningless on the surface. They discussed the event, the guest list, a new architectural project. Yet every sentence was a negotiation, every glance a battle. Elena watched their bodies betray what their voices concealed. The faint lean toward each other, the barely perceptible pause before eye contact broke. When Sabrina drifted away, laughter trailing behind her like perfume, Elena felt her pulse steady. The truth had finally taken form. It wasn't a suspicion anymore. It had a name, a voice, a face. Ryan turned toward her, smiling too quickly. "She's one of the associates at the firm." "Brilliant, really. Richard's latest hire." Elena tilted her head, her tone soft but edged. "Is that what she is?" He blinked. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing," she said. "Just an observation." They stood in silence for a moment. Around them, the room glittered with other people's illusions. Somewhere across the crowd, Sabrina's laughter broke again. Bright, musical, painfully alive. Ryan's jaw tightened. "Don't start," he muttered. "I didn't," Elena replied. "You did." He turned away, leaving her beside a marble pillar like a misplaced ornament. She found the bar and ordered a glass of wine. The music shifted to something slower, a waltz that wrapped itself around the couples moving gracefully across the floor. She watched them, the practiced elegance of people who wanted to be admired more than loved. For years, she'd been one of them. "You look like you could use an escape route." The voice came from her left, warm, low, carrying an easy humor. She turned to find a man standing beside her, holding a camera instead of a drink. "I'm sorry?" He smiled. "You don't seem like the kind of person who enjoys pretending for strangers." Micah Rivers. He offered his hand. "I'm shooting the event for the Foundation's annual campaign." "Elena Brooks," she replied, shaking his hand. His touch was gentle but grounded, his eyes steady, the kind that actually looked at you, not through you. He studied her for a moment, not rudely, but as though trying to match the woman before him with the expression on her face. "Most people here look like they're auditioning for approval," he said. "You look like you're trying to remember why you came." She laughed softly, surprised. "Maybe I am. Then at least you're honest." They stood at the bar, talking, not about architecture or charity, but about art, color, and the way cities could feel lonely even when they were full of people. Micah spoke with a quiet conviction that reminded her of something she used to have before she traded it for composure. For 20 minutes, she forgot the weight she carried. She even smiled, a real, unguarded smile that reached her eyes. Then Ryan appeared. He placed a hand on her arm, his voice clipped. "There you are. I've been looking for you." Micah extended his hand. "We were just talking about the exhibit upstairs. The lighting's incredible." Ryan's handshake was brief. "Thanks for entertaining my wife. We have people to meet." Elena felt his grip tighten slightly, a silent warning. She looked at him, his immaculate suit, his cold civility, and something in her finally shifted from hurt to clarity. As Micah turned away, she heard herself say, "You didn't seem to mind entertaining Sabrina." Ryan froze, The air between them crackled. "Watch what you're implying." "I'm not implying," she said quietly. "I'm observing. Like you asked me to smile." His expression hardened. "You're being ridiculous. Don't make a scene." She set her glass down. "Then stop giving me one to clean up." For a moment, she thought he might say something cruel. Instead, he stepped back, his mask slipping just enough for her to glimpse the man beneath. Irritated, exposed, afraid. He smoothed his tie, straightened his jacket, and walked away. Elena turned back to the crowd. The waltz had ended. Applause rippled through the room, polite and hollow. She felt strangely calm. The facade had cracked, and through the fracture came air. Sharp, clean, and undeniable. For years, she had mistaken composure for strength. But standing there, surrounded by crystal light and counterfeit smiles, she realized the truth. Silence wasn't grace. It was surrender. And tonight, she was done surrendering. The snow had thickened by the time the gala ended, wrapping Chicago in a quiet stillness that the city rarely allowed itself. The marble steps outside the museum glistened under the streetlights, slick and luminous, as guests hurried into waiting cars, their laughter fading into the night. Elena stepped out alone. The air was sharp against her skin, and the wind caught the hem of her gown, sending it whispering around her ankles like a secret. Ryan was nowhere in sight. He had left shortly after their argument, muttering something about business associates to catch up with. She hadn't followed. For the first time in years, she didn't feel compelled to chase the disappearing shape of him. She stood beneath the portico, her bare shoulders trembling against the cold, watching the city blur in white and gold. Somewhere behind her, the faint click of a camera shutter broke the silence. Once, twice, deliberate, measured, almost musical. Elena turned. Micah Rivers stood a few paces away, the photographer she'd spoken to earlier, his dark coat dusted with snow, his camera hanging from its strap like a trusted companion. His hair was damp from the weather, his smile unhurried, unguarded. "Sorry," he said, lowering the camera slightly. "The light hit just right." "I couldn't resist." She raised an eyebrow. "You're taking pictures of women standing alone in the cold now?" "Only when they look like they're about to leave one life behind and step into another." There was no flirtation in his tone, just observation, quiet and precise. The kind of voice that made you feel seen rather than studied. Elena's lips parted, caught somewhere between protest and curiosity. "That's an oddly specific thing to photograph." Micah smiled faintly. "I specialize in specific things." He lifted the camera again, waiting. Not asking permission this time. Waiting, as though he trusted her to decide what she wanted to give. Elena turned slightly toward the snow, her profile catching the soft glow from the street lamp. The shutter clicked again, a whisper of sound. "You photograph people like they're confessions," she said. "That's what they usually are," he replied. They stood there for a moment, surrounded by the muffled hush of snowfall. It felt like the world had paused, the noise of the gala replaced by something truer. Two strangers suspended in a space between endings and beginnings. "Can I buy you a coffee?" Micah asked, his tone casual but his eyes kind. "It's freezing, and I don't think either of us belongs back in there." Elena hesitated. The instinct to refuse, to retreat, to guard herself, rose immediately. Yet beneath it was something else, something she hadn't felt in a long time. A pulse of curiosity, faint but alive. "All right," she said softly. They found a small cafe still open on Michigan Avenue, its windows fogged from warmth, the scent of roasted beans heavy in the air. The space was half empty. A few students with laptops, a couple whispering over mugs of cocoa. Elena removed her gloves, wrapping her fingers around a cup that steamed between her palms. Micah sat across from her, his camera resting on the table, its lens fogged from the cold. "So," she began, "you take pictures of strangers for a living?" "I take pictures of stories," he said. "People just happen to be the ones telling them." "That sounds poetic." "It's work," he said with a modest shrug. "Sometimes the story is obvious. Sometimes it hides behind perfect smiles." The words lingered between them. Elena looked down at her coffee. "You saw it, didn't you?" she asked quietly. "Back at the gala." Micah didn't pretend not to understand. "Yes," he said simply, but it's not my story to tell." She studied him for a moment. The easy stillness, the quiet conviction in his tone. He didn't look away, but he didn't pry either. It was rare, she thought, to meet someone who could witness pain without turning it into curiosity. They talked about art, cities, color, solitude. He told her about his latest project, a series of portraits capturing people in transit, moments between one life and the next. Airports, train stations, hospital waiting rooms. "We're never more honest than when we're between destinations," he said. "That's when we forget to perform." Elena smiled faintly. "I've been performing for years." He leaned back, watching her carefully. "Then maybe it's time to stop." The simplicity of his words struck her like a chord she hadn't realized she was still capable of hearing. For a long time she'd surrounded herself with surfaces: glass, marble, carefully chosen fabrics, polite conversations. But Micah spoke as if he saw through the layers, straight into the quiet ache underneath. When she didn't answer, he changed the subject, asking about her design work. She told him about colors, about how she used to believe that every space could be healed by balance, the right blend of light and texture, of shape and purpose. "Now," she said, tracing her finger along the rim of her cup, "I think balance is overrated. Some spaces are meant to be broken before they can breathe." Micah smiled. "You sound like an artist." "I used to be," she said. "No," he replied gently, "you still are. You're just remembering it." Something in her chest tightened. She looked at him and saw not a stranger but a mirror, one that didn't distort her reflection, one that didn't shrink her into someone easier to manage. Outside, the snow kept falling, erasing footprints, softening the edges of the city. Time seemed suspended, the cafe's warmth cocooning them in quiet defiance of everything waiting beyond its walls. When she finally glanced at her watch, it was nearly 2 in the morning. "I should go," she said, though her voice betrayed reluctance. "I'll walk you," he offered. They stepped outside, the cold wrapping around them again. The streets were nearly empty, the snow deepening into a slow, relentless hush. He walked beside her without speaking, matching her pace, letting the silence stretch comfortably between them. At the corner where their paths would part, Elena stopped. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For not asking questions I wasn't ready to answer." He nodded. "You don't owe anyone explanations, Elena." She blinked, surprised he remembered her name. "Good memory." "I pay attention," he said simply. She smiled then, a real smile, soft and unguarded. "Good night, Micah." "Good night." He stood there as she crossed the street, the snow catching in her hair, her green dress glowing faintly under the lamplight. For a brief moment, she looked like part of the snowfall itself, delicate, untouchable, but entirely real. When she disappeared into the darkness, Micah lifted his camera one last time and took a single photograph. Not of her face, but of her shadow against the snow, walking away from the museum, away from the past. Later, as Elena reached her apartment and slipped out of her gown, she caught her reflection in the mirror. Her face was bare, her eyes tired but luminous. For the first time in years, she didn't look invisible. Somewhere, in the quiet ache of her heart, she felt the faint pulse of something returning. Not love, not yet, but possibility. And for the first time in a long while, that was enough. The morning after the gala arrived in shades of silver and quiet. Snow still clung to the rooftops, and the city was wrapped in that rare stillness that only follows a storm, the kind that makes everything seem suspended, waiting. Inside the glass apartment, the world felt sharper. Even the air seemed to hum with something unspoken. Ryan had come home past midnight. Elena had heard the door open, the faint scuff of his shoes on marble, the quiet way he moved, careful, guilty, practiced. He thought she was asleep. She wasn't. She lay there, eyes closed, listening to the sound of him undressing, the zipper, the soft clink of his cufflinks hitting the dresser. She wondered, as she had 100 times before, if there was any version of truth left between them that wasn't filtered through convenience or fear. By morning, she'd decided there wasn't. She found him in the kitchen, immaculate as ever, pouring black coffee into a porcelain cup. His suit was pressed, his tie perfect. Everything about him seemed rehearsed, even his sigh as he glanced at the morning headlines on his phone. "Elena," he said without looking up, You're awake early. She leaned against the doorway, arms folded. I could say the same about you. He offered a faint smile, one he'd perfected for boardrooms and photographs. Big day. Presentation for the mayor's office. The usual chaos. She watched him take a sip of coffee. How was your chaos last night? His eyes flicked up, confused. Last night? At the gala. With Sabrina Lewis. The name landed like a blade. He froze for half a second. So brief it might have gone unnoticed if she hadn't been watching for it. Then came the familiar recovery, the small chuckle, the easy shrug. She's a colleague, Elena. Don't do this. Do what? Her voice was soft, deliberate. Ask about the woman you've been seeing. The cup hit the counter with a sharp, hollow sound. For the first time in a long time, the calm mask slipped. You've been reading my messages, he said. It wasn't a question. I didn't have to, she replied. The way you look at her is loud enough. He ran a hand over his jaw, exhaling through his teeth. You're overreacting. It was harmless. You're twisting something small into something ugly. Elena took a slow step closer. Harmless, she repeated. Is that what you call it when you tell another woman that I'm furniture? Predictable? Convenient? The color drained from his face. He looked at her then, really looked. But the silence that followed wasn't remorse. It was calculation. You went through my phone. Don't do that, she said sharply. Don't make this about privacy when the crime is betrayal. Ryan's tone hardened. You have no idea how much pressure I've been under. The firm, the investors, everyone expects perfection. You used to understand that. You used to help me keep it together. I did, she said quietly. But helping you keep your lies together isn't the same as loving you. He laughed, a short, bitter sound. So what now? You're the wounded heroine? You're going to punish me with your silence? No, she said. I'm going to end it. The words landed between them like thunder. Small, simple, irreversible. Ryan blinked. And what, exactly? This, she said, gesturing at the space between them. The pristine kitchen, the 2 perfect cups of coffee, the life that had become a performance neither of them believed in, the pretending, the waiting for you to remember who I am. He set the cup down slowly. You're being dramatic. I'm being honest, she said. You should try it sometime. For a moment, neither of them moved. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator, the snow melting against the glass. Then Ryan stepped closer, lowering his voice as though gentleness could rewrite history. Elena, he said, we've built a life together. Everything we have, this apartment, our reputation, it's because we work. You and I make sense. She met his gaze, her eyes steady. We make sense on paper, but I'm done living like a line item in your portfolio. Something flickered across his face. Frustration, disbelief, maybe even fear. You're not thinking clearly. People don't throw away marriages over one mistake. People don't call their wives furniture if they still see them as human, she replied. The words cut through him, sharp and final. He opened his mouth to respond, but stopped when he saw the tears welling in her eyes. Not the kind that begged for sympathy, but the kind that marked the end of endurance. I gave you everything I could, she said softly. My time, my silence, my belief that what we had was still worth saving. But I can't keep loving a ghost of the man I thought you were. Ryan looked away, jaw clenched, his knuckles white against the counter. You'll regret this, he said finally, his voice low, almost a whisper. I already do, she said. The quiet that followed was unbearable. He turned, grabbing his coat from the chair, his movements clipped, furious. I'll be at the office, he said, his tone brittle. We can talk when you've calmed down. Don't bother, she said. There's nothing left to calm. The door closed behind him, and the apartment fell into a silence so complete it felt sacred. Elena stood there, her breath shaking, her pulse heavy in her throat. She didn't cry. Not yet. Instead, she poured his untouched coffee down the sink and washed the cup, methodically, until the water ran clear. The rhythm of it grounded her. For years, she had built her world around Ryan's moods, adjusting, soothing, shrinking herself to fit the narrow space his affection allowed. Now that he was gone, she felt the strange, terrifying freedom of an unoccupied silence. When she finally turned toward the window, the city below looked different. Not kinder, Not easier, but vast, endless. The reflection in the glass caught her off guard. Her eyes were red, her lips trembling, but there was something fierce beneath the fragility. A quiet defiance she hadn't seen in years. It struck her then that maybe this trembling, this breaking open, wasn't weakness. It was release. And as she stood there, the faint hum of the city rising from below, Elena understood something she hadn't allowed herself to believe. Endings weren't always destruction. Sometimes they were the first honest breath after years of holding one's lungs still. The quiet war was over, but the real fight, the one for herself, had just begun. For 3 days, the apartment remained suspended in silence, not the heavy, anxious silence that used to follow their arguments, but a strange, weightless quiet that felt almost clean. Ryan hadn't come home. No calls, no messages, not even the perfunctory texts about schedules and meetings that had once filled the spaces between them. Elena moved through the rooms like a ghost, rediscovering her own haunting. Every corner of the place carried a trace of him. The cologne that clung to the hallway, the books aligned with obsessive precision, the framed photographs that once told a story she no longer believed. She found herself pausing at the piano. Ryan had bought it 2 years ago, insisting that every elegant home needs one, even though neither of them played. It had become a symbol, she realized, of everything he valued. Presentation over presence, impression over emotion. The keys, untouched and pristine, reflected her face as she stood there, lost in the echo of a life that had never been hers. The days blurred. She worked remotely, answering emails mechanically, avoiding calls from friends who would ask too many questions. Tessa had texted, "Are you okay?" And she had typed out half a dozen replies before deleting them all. What could she say? That she felt both free and broken, both lighter and lonelier than she'd ever imagined possible? On the 4th morning, she opened the curtains and saw sunlight cutting across the city. It had snowed again overnight, but the sky was blue now. A fragile kind of blue, the color of things just beginning to heal. She made coffee, black and bitter, and stood at the window watching the rooftops glitter under the thawing ice. There was an urge in her, subtle but insistent, to clear, to cleanse, to strip away everything that still smelled of him. It began with the closet, the suits she'd chosen for him over the years, the silk ties that matched her dresses for galas, the colognes he'd worn to dinners where she'd smiled beside him, pretending not to see the distance in his eyes. One by one, she pulled them down, folded them neatly, and placed them in boxes. Each item was a fragment of the illusion they'd built together, pieces of a life curated for display. Then came the photographs, the wedding picture on the bookshelf, the framed vacation shots in Florence, the candid one he had once loved of her laughing on the balcony. She set them on the counter in a small, careful pile. When she finished, she opened the balcony doors. The cold rushed in, sharp and bracing, carrying the scent of snow and exhaust. Elena stood there for a long time, the city sprawling beneath her like a living map, messy, imperfect, alive. She struck a match. The flame trembled for a moment before catching, orange against the pale winter air. One by one, she fed the photographs to it. They curled quickly, the edges blackening before turning to white ash. Ryan's face disappeared first, then hers, until all that remained were warped fragments of color and the faint smell of burnt paper. The wind lifted the ashes and carried them over the balcony, scattering them into the cold morning. She watched them drift until they vanished, dissolving into nothing, or perhaps into everything. For the first time, she didn't cry. She only exhaled. The act wasn't rage, it was release. When the fire was gone, she closed the door and sat on the couch, her hands trembling slightly. The air inside the apartment felt different. Not empty, but spacious, as if something sacred had been returned to her. She didn't know what would come next, only that it couldn't be what came before. Later that day, her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "Heard you might need new beginnings. M." She didn't have to ask who it was. Micah. A faint smile touched her lips. She hadn't seen him since that snowy night outside the museum. Yet somehow his presence had lingered in her mind, like a note she couldn't stop hearing. Calm, steady, unfinished. She typed a reply before she could overthink it. Maybe. but I'm still figuring out what that means." The response came a few minutes later. "Figuring out is where all the beauty starts." She stared at the words, her fingers hovering over the screen, then set the phone aside. She wasn't ready for beauty yet, but she could feel the faint pulse of possibility beneath the wreckage, a small ember refusing to die. That night, she dreamed of water. She stood at the edge of Lake Michigan, the wind tangling through her hair. The horizon stretched endlessly, dark and luminous, as if it were waiting for her. The waves touched her feet, cold but alive. Somewhere behind her, she heard a voice, low, steady, familiar, whisper her name. When she turned, there was no one there. Only the camera's faint click, echoing across the water. She woke with tears on her cheeks and the strange, peaceful ache of recognition. The next morning, she packed a small bag. Not to leave, not yet, but to step outside, to breathe again. She took her sketchbook, a few pencils, and a scarf that wasn't one of Ryan's gifts. The streets were slushy, but the air was bright. She walked without direction, letting the city lead her. At a small corner cafe, she stopped for coffee. The barista smiled at her, not with pity, but with the simple kindness of a stranger who didn't know her story. She smiled back. As she sat by the window, sketching the reflection of the street on melting snow, she realized something unexpected. She wasn't erasing Ryan from her life. She was reclaiming the space he had taken up inside it. Grief, she understood now, wasn't always about losing someone. Sometimes it was about finding yourself again in the ruins they left behind. When she returned home that evening, the apartment was dim, the city lights painting soft patterns on the walls. She lit a single candle and placed it on the table, not for memory, but for transition. The flame swayed gently, casting a warm glow across her face. The ashes were gone, the air was clear, and for the first time since everything fell apart, Elena felt the quiet hum of something she hadn't dared to name in years. Hope. The first thing Elena noticed after Ryan left was not the emptiness of the apartment. It was the sound, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the whisper of traffic from below, the soft ticking of the clock she had once bought simply because its rhythm felt soothing. For years she had lived inside a silence that belonged to him, a curated quiet, delicate and decorative, designed to conceal discomfort. Now, for the first time, the silence was hers, and it was loud. She began to understand that silence was not the absence of noise, but the absence of permission. Permission to speak, to want, to contradict, to exist freely. She had spent years lowering her voice to keep peace, swallowing sentences that might have saved her, and smiling through words that deserved to be said out loud. Unlearning that felt like learning to breathe again. At first, she spoke to no one. Instead, she filled the rooms with small, ordinary sounds, music playing softly in the kitchen, the rustle of sketchbook pages, the hum of the kettle as water boiled. She played Nina Simone and Bill Evans, and sometimes let the record spin long after the music ended, the soft crackle of vinyl keeping her company. Each sound felt like defiance, a quiet, graceful rebellion against all the years she had been careful. She began painting again, not for clients, not for exhibitions, for herself. Her hands remembered what her mind had forgotten, how color could heal, how texture could hold emotion when words could not. The first painting was a mess of blues and grays, streaked with sharp edges of gold. It wasn't beautiful. It was honest. She hung it in the living room, right where Ryan's favorite abstract print had once been. By the third week, she noticed the air had changed. The apartment no longer felt like his space. It smelled of turpentine, jasmine tea, and possibility. She moved the furniture, threw out the heavy curtains, opened the windows wide. Cold air rushed in, biting and clean, filling the space with something close to freedom. When Tessa came by one evening, she stopped in the doorway, blinking in surprise. "You've changed everything," she said. Elena smiled. "I had to." The walls were still speaking his language. They sat on the floor, drinking wine from mismatched glasses. For the first time in months, Elena told the story. Not the edited, polished version, but the raw, tangled truth. The affair, the manipulation, the way she'd lost herself by degrees, mistaking restraint for love. Tessa listened, her eyes fierce. "You were never the problem," she said. Elena looked down, swirling the wine in her glass. "Maybe not, but I let the problem become my normal. Then it's time to redefine normal. It sounded simple when Tessa said it, but change, Elena was learning, wasn't a switch. It was a practice. In the days that followed, she began writing again, short reflections, fragments of thought, sometimes just sentences that came to her in the quiet. Healing is not about forgetting. Love is not a mirror, it's a window. Silence is not peace if it costs you your voice. She wrote them on scraps of paper and taped them to the wall. Her own private manifesto. One afternoon, while sketching at the cafe she had discovered weeks earlier, she heard a familiar voice. Still painting the world back together? Micah stood there, camera slung over his shoulder, his expression warm but restrained. He looked different in daylight, less mysterious, more real. "I'm trying," she said. "Some days it works." He gestured to the seat across from her. "May I?" She nodded. They talked easily, about art, about winter light, about the strange way time seemed to stretch when you were rebuilding yourself. He told her about his new project, a photo series on honest spaces, portraits of people in rooms they hadn't yet finished healing in. "It's about truth," he said. "Not the kind you show the world, but the kind you can barely stand to look at yourself." Elena smiled faintly. "You sound like someone who's done a lot of looking." "Maybe," he said, "but I think you've done more." She didn't answer. Instead, she studied him. The calm steadiness of his gaze, the absence of judgment. There was something grounding about him, something that didn't demand or define. He existed like an open space, and for the first time, she realized how rare that was. "Would you ever let me photograph you?" he asked quietly. She hesitated. "Why me?" "Because you don't pose," he said, "even when you're trying to." Elena laughed softly. "I don't know if I'm ready for that kind of honesty." "Then I'll wait," he said simply. It wasn't an invitation or a promise. It was patience, and it disarmed her completely. After he left, she walked home slowly, thinking about the way his words had settled inside her. There had been no grand declarations, no spark of sudden romance, just quiet understanding, the kind that asks nothing and gives everything. That night she cooked dinner for herself. Nothing elaborate, pasta with olive oil and herbs, a glass of red wine. She ate by the window, watching the city lights pulse and flicker. For years she had cooked for someone else, adjusting recipes to Ryan's taste, timing everything to his schedule. Now the simple act of feeding herself felt sacred. Later, she stood at the mirror, brushing her hair, studying her reflection. Her face looked different, not softer, not harder, but real. There was a quiet confidence in her eyes, the kind that doesn't need permission to exist. Unlearning silence, she realized, wasn't about speaking louder. It was about speaking truth, gently, consistently, until the sound of your own voice no longer startled you. In the weeks that followed, she said no more often. She stopped apologizing for taking up space. She reconnected with old friends she'd drifted from, started teaching a weekend workshop in color theory, and began sketching portraits again, each one an exploration of vulnerability, of people learning to inhabit themselves fully. Sometimes, when she passed the mirror, she caught her reflection and didn't look away. She didn't see the woman Ryan had diminished, nor the one who'd burned her past to ashes. She saw someone still becoming, someone unfinished, but whole in the process. And that, she thought, was the quietest kind of strength there was. One evening, as twilight deepened over the lake, she stepped onto her balcony. The city glowed beneath her, endless and alive. The cold bit her skin, but she didn't flinch. She closed her eyes and let the wind rush through her hair, carrying away the last remnants of who she had been. In that still, luminous moment, Elena realized she no longer feared the quiet, because this time, the silence spoke her name. When Elena found the apartment in Bronzeville, it was nothing like the glass and marble symmetry she had lived in before. The building was old, its bricks weathered by decades of rain and wind, the hallways echoing faintly with jazz from some unseen neighbor's stereo. The windows didn't gleam, they breathed. And that, she thought, was enough. The realtor had apologized for the creaking floors, the uneven paint, the old-fashioned radiator humming like an old heartbeat. Elena only smiled. "I like places that sound alive," she'd said. 2 weeks later, she moved in. Her life fit into surprisingly few boxes. Most of what she'd once owned had stayed behind. The sleek furniture, the designer decor, the thousand little artifacts of Ryan's curated world. What she brought with her instead were her sketches, a few worn books, a stack of canvases, and the scent of something new. Freedom, still fragile, still finding its shape. The first night, she sat cross-legged on the wooden floor, surrounded by unpacked boxes, eating takeout noodles straight from the carton. Outside, the city hummed differently here, lower, earthier, human. Somewhere down the street, someone was laughing. A car passed, its headlights sweeping across her wall like a brief visitation of light. She realized she wasn't lonely. She was alone. And that was something entirely different. The apartment was small but generous with light. In the mornings, sunlight spilled through the tall windows and stretched across the worn wooden floors, touching everything with quiet grace. The walls were imperfect, uneven plaster, small cracks tracing delicate veins through the paint. But Elena found herself tracing them with her fingers, as if they were lines of a story she'd just begun to read. She painted the living room herself, a warm cream with hints of ochre. The scent of fresh paint clung to her hands for days. She liked it, the proof of her labor, the evidence of becoming. In the afternoons, she'd sit by the window with her sketchbook, watching the neighborhood unfold below. Bronzeville was alive with motion. Children chasing basketballs on cracked sidewalks, elders tending to small gardens by stoops, music drifting from barbershops and corner cafes. It was a rhythm of real lives, unpolished and unpretending, and it soothed her in a way that stillness never could. Sometimes Micah stopped by. The first time, he brought her a plant, a fiddle-leaf fig, tall and unruly. "Every artist needs something green," he said, setting it by the window. Elena laughed. "You assume I can keep it alive." He smiled. "It's stubborn, like you." They talked for hours that day, about art, about rhythm, about the strange intimacy of rebuilding a life. He photographed her apartment, capturing the sunlight on the floorboards, the reflection of her easel in the window pane, the way her shadow fell against the wall as she painted. She didn't pose. She didn't need to. He said the space already spoke for her. One evening, he brought his camera again, and she caught him studying her while pretending to adjust his lens. "What are you looking for this time?" she asked. "The moment before you stop pretending you're fine," he said softly. She smiled, sad but unflinching. "Then you'll be waiting a while." He didn't reply, only lifted the camera and clicked the shutter. Once, gently, as though capturing the breath between healing and heartbreak. Their connection grew slowly, like light seeping through a crack under a door. There were no declarations, no sudden collisions, just presence. Two people learning to exist beside each other without needing to fill every silence. At night, after he left, Elena would lie awake and listen to the city's heartbeat. Sirens, laughter, wind, the lullaby of living things. She'd think of the old apartment, the sterile quiet, the way her voice used to bounce off glass and return smaller each time. Here, the silence had texture. It was filled with the hum of life, with the warmth of her own breathing. One morning, she found herself walking through the neighborhood market. The air smelled of roasted coffee and citrus, the stalls overflowing with colors, oranges, sunflowers, bolts of fabric dyed in impossible shades. A woman selling hand-woven baskets called out to her, smiling. "You just moved in, didn't you?" "I can always tell." "How?" Elena asked. "You look like someone who's beginning again," the woman said. Elena smiled, her chest tightening with something that felt like recognition. That night, she painted the first piece she'd loved in years. It wasn't meticulous or controlled. It was wild, strokes of copper and indigo, lines crossing and bleeding into each other. A portrait of chaos made beautiful. When she stepped back, she realized it was the most honest thing she'd ever made. Micah came by the next day and stood in front of it for a long time. "It looks like fire and water at once," he murmured. She tilted her head. "It's called ashes." He nodded, his voice almost reverent. "Then it's perfect." After he left, Elena opened the window wide. The evening breeze carried the scent of lilacs and smoke from a distant grill. She leaned against the sill, her hair tousled by the wind, and looked out at the patchwork of lights below. She had thought she'd escape one life to find another. But standing there, she realized she hadn't escaped anything. She had reclaimed it. The city, the noise, the imperfection. It all pulsed with a heartbeat she finally recognized as her own. In Bronzeville, the nights were never quiet. Music drifted through walls, laughter spilled into the streets, and somewhere nearby, someone was always awake, dreaming. It wasn't peace in the traditional sense. It was something better. It was life, messy and whole and in motion. Elena closed her eyes and breathed deeply, her chest rising with the rhythm of the city. The apartment was small. The floors creaked. The radiator hummed its uneven song. And for the first time, every sound felt like belonging. Desire, Elena had learned, was not always loud. Sometimes it began as a quiet hum beneath the surface of ordinary days, an ache that didn't announce itself, but settled softly into the spaces between breaths. It wasn't the kind of wanting that demanded or consumed. It was slower, steadier, almost reverent, the kind that carried both fear and recognition. It started with the smallest things. Micah brushing paint flecks from her wrist as they worked side by side on a mural for the neighborhood art center. The way his laughter slipped through her guard when he teased her about her perfectionism. The pause before he spoke. The rare stillness in his gaze that made her feel seen. Not the way Ryan had seen her, as a possession or reflection, but as something in motion, becoming. They were careful, both of them. Micah had his own shadows. She could sense them in the way he sometimes went quiet when conversation turned toward love or permanence. There were stories behind his eyes, unspoken but present, as if the camera he carried had seen too much loss to believe easily and forever. And Elena, she was still learning how to live without walls. Yet when they were together, time softened. The world stopped demanding so much. One afternoon, they painted in near silence. The mural was nearly complete, a sweep of bronze and teal stretching across a brick wall, depicting hands reaching toward light. Elena stood back, wiping color from her fingers, and caught Micah watching her instead of the wall. "What?" she asked, smiling. He hesitated, his brush still in hand. "You look..." He trailed off, searching for the right word. "Unburdened." She tilted her head. "That's dangerous. I might get used to it." He laughed, low and genuine. "Then let it happen." She looked away before he could see the warmth rising to her cheeks. It was dangerous, this quiet wanting. Not because it hurt, but because it healed. Because for the first time since Ryan, she could feel desire without shame. It was not tethered to performance or perfection. It simply existed, gentle and human. That night she couldn't sleep. The air in her apartment felt too full, the echoes of the day still humming under her skin. She poured herself a glass of wine and sat by the window, watching the streetlights flicker on one by one. She thought of Micah, his hands stained with color, his voice steady, his quiet patience. The way he listened without trying to fix her. The way he left space where Ryan would have filled silence with his own certainty. There was a kind of gravity in that gentleness, and she could feel herself orbiting closer to it with every passing day. But love, if that's what this was, terrified her. Because love had once been a trap, a performance, a place where her voice disappeared. And yet, the more she resisted it, the more it found its way back to her. The next evening, Micah stopped by, unannounced. He stood in her doorway, holding a box of pastries and 2 steaming cups of coffee. "Peace offering," he said. "For what?" "For nothing. For today. For showing up." They ate on the floor, their backs against the wall, the faint sounds of jazz floating up from a neighbor's radio. It felt easy, that rare kind of simplicity that doesn't need explanation. When she laughed at one of his stories, he reached out and brushed a crumb from her lip. The touch was fleeting, but it rippled through her like a small, deliberate spark. Their eyes met, and the air shifted. Neither moved for a long time. The world seemed to narrow to the space between them. His breath, her heartbeat, the unspoken understanding that they were standing at the edge of something fragile and real. "I shouldn't," she whispered. He nodded slowly. "I know," but he didn't move away. And she didn't either. When he finally leaned forward, it wasn't hunger that guided him. It was reverence. The kiss was soft, uncertain, almost trembling in its restraint. A meeting, not a claim. For Elena, it felt like stepping into sunlight after years underground. When they pulled apart, she kept her eyes closed, her hands resting against his chest. "I'm still learning how to be whole," she said. "I know," he murmured. "I'm not here to finish you, just to meet you where you are." She smiled then, a quiet, trembling smile that tasted of gratitude and disbelief. They stayed like that, leaning into the warmth of the moment, as the sounds of the city drifted in through the open window. Laughter, distant sirens, the low hum of a passing train. Life, imperfect and ongoing. Later, after he left, Elena stood before her easel, unable to sleep. She began to paint without thinking, not an image but a feeling. Brushstrokes of red and bronze, layered with shades of deep green. The color of heartbeats, the color of daring. When she stepped back, she realized it wasn't about him. Not really. It was about her. About wanting without losing herself. About learning that vulnerability wasn't weakness, but courage. She cleaned her brushes and opened the window. The night air was cool, carrying the faint scent of rain. Somewhere, someone was playing a trumpet, the notes drifting slow and mournful down the street. Elena closed her eyes and listened. For the first time in her life, she didn't silence the wanting. She let it live inside her, not as need, but as proof that she had survived enough to still feel. Desire, she thought, wasn't something to fear. It was something to honor. The pulse of life that reminded her she was still capable of joy. And though she didn't know where this fragile tenderness with Micah would lead, she knew this much with absolute certainty. She no longer wanted love that asked her to disappear. She wanted love that made her louder. Love that met her where she stood, unbroken, unfinished, and free. Winter gave way to a shy, tentative spring, the kind that still remembered frost but dared to dream of warmth. In Bronzeville, the trees along the boulevard began to blush with the first buds of green, and the air carried the scent of rain mixed with asphalt and hope. For the first time in years, Elena found herself waking to the sound of birds instead of alarms. Her days unfolded gently now, guided not by someone else's expectations but by her own quiet rhythm. Morning sunlight spilled across her canvases, dappling unfinished paintings in soft gold. The apartment, still imperfect, still humming with life, had become a reflection of her, a place both in progress and at peace. And yet, peace, she discovered, could be as frightening as chaos. There were moments, still quiet moments, when she would stand before a blank canvas and feel her hands tremble. The fear wasn't of failure anymore. It was of fullness, of what might happen if she stopped surviving long enough to start living again. Micah sensed it before she said a word. He had a way of showing up when her courage faltered, not with answers, but with presence. Sometimes he'd find her in the studio, still in her paint-streaked clothes, lost somewhere between creation and doubt. He never interrupted. He would sit on the floor beside her, camera in hand, waiting until the silence softened. One afternoon, as the light turned amber through the window, she spoke without looking at him. "Do you ever feel like you've rebuilt yourself so carefully that you forget what it's like to just be?" Micah looked up from the photo he was editing. "All the time," he said. "But maybe being careful is how we earn the right to be careless again." She turned, studying him. "You make it sound simple." "It's not," he said with a small smile. "It's just true." He stood then, walking over to where she stood before a half-finished painting, a cascade of color that seemed to shimmer with motion. "What's this one called?" "I don't know yet," she said. "It feels like it's waiting for something." He nodded, stepping closer until he was beside her. "Maybe it's waiting for you to stop asking permission." The words landed deeper than he could have known. She glanced at him, then back at the canvas. The image wasn't wrong. It was just incomplete. Like her, like every truth she had ever been afraid to claim. Without speaking, she picked up the brush and drew a streak of crimson across the surface. Bold, imperfect, alive. Micah didn't move. He simply watched as she worked, her strokes growing more certain, her breath syncing with the rhythm of creation. When she finally stepped back, the canvas was transformed. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't neat, but it was honest. "That," Micah said softly, "is what freedom looks like." Something inside her broke open, not painfully, but completely. She laughed, a sudden, radiant sound that startled even her. For the first time in years, her laughter filled the room without apology. It was that same evening when she realized she no longer measured her worth by what she could hold together. She was learning to value what she could release. Over the next few weeks, she began saying yes, not out of obligation, but curiosity. She joined a community art program for local youth, teaching them how to translate emotion into color. She accepted an invitation to showcase her work at a small gallery downtown. She started walking home without her headphones, letting the city's rhythm write its own kind of music. Micah helped her hang her paintings for the exhibit. The gallery was small. White walls, polished wood floors, the faint scent of varnish. When she looked at her pieces hanging there, she felt a strange, unfamiliar tenderness toward herself. These weren't just paintings. They were confessions, proof that beauty could come from breaking. As guests filtered in, Elena moved through the room with quiet grace. She was no longer performing. She was simply present. Midway through the evening, she turned to find Ryan standing near the doorway. For a heartbeat, her body went still. He looked almost exactly as she remembered. Crisp suit, immaculate posture, that air of controlled composure. But there was something brittle in his eyes now, something uncertain. He held a glass of wine too tightly, his knuckles pale against the stem. "Elena," he said softly. Her name, from his lips, no longer had the power it once did. "Ryan," she said, calm and even, "I didn't expect to see you here. I heard about the show. I wanted to see what you've been doing." She smiled faintly. "Living." He glanced at the paintings, at the vivid colors and raw textures, and she could see the discomfort flicker across his face. "It's different from your old work." "It should be," she said. "I'm different." He hesitated. "You look good." "Thank you," she said simply. There was no anger, no longing, no need for closure. That, she realized, was the closure. Ryan looked as if he wanted to say more, but he didn't. He only nodded once, awkwardly, and left his glass on a nearby table before disappearing into the crowd. When he was gone, Micah appeared beside her. "You okay?" She nodded. "Better than okay." He studied her face, the ease in her posture, the steadiness in her breath. "That looked like peace." "It was," she said quietly. "Not revenge, not regret. Just peace." Later that night, after the gallery emptied, Elena stood before her favorite painting, the one she had finished that day in her studio, crimson and gold and motion. She finally knew what to call it. The breakthrough. It wasn't about him. It wasn't even about love. It was about the moment she stopped looking backward. The instant she understood that healing wasn't a return, it was a rebirth. Micah walked up behind her, slipping his hand gently into hers. "You did it," he whispered. "No," she said, smiling softly. "I'm doing it." Outside, the city pulsed with life. Sirens, laughter, rain beginning to fall against the glass. Inside, beneath the warm light, Elena let the weight she'd carried for years dissolve into something lighter. Wanting, she realized, had once been her cage, but now it was her compass. And as the night deepened, she felt it. The quiet joy of someone who had finally learned not just to survive her story, but to shape it. It happened on an afternoon so bright that even the shadows looked golden. The gallery's windows glowed in the late spring sun, casting fractured light across Elena's newest exhibit, a collection called Becoming. Each canvas was a confession, fragments of color, layers of memory, the language of transformation rendered in paint. She had spent the morning answering questions from a local arts journalist, her voice calm, her answers reflective. It still felt surreal sometimes, to be seen for what she created rather than who she stood beside. When the interview ended, she stayed to help rearrange a few displays, humming under her breath. That was when the door opened, the small brass bell chiming softly. Elena looked up. Sabrina Lewis stood at the threshold. For a moment, the air itself seemed to still, not with dread, but recognition. The woman before her was both familiar and unrecognizable. Sabrina's beauty was intact, of course, effortless, camera-ready, but there was something altered in the set of her shoulders, in the faint weariness behind her eyes. "Elena," she said, her voice quiet, careful. "I hope it's not strange that I came." Elena blinked once, slowly. "That depends on why you're here." Sabrina stepped inside, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. She looked around at the paintings, the ones alive with motion, with color, with truth, and her expression softened. "You're really good," she said, almost as if to herself. "I mean, I knew you were creative, but this is something else." Elena didn't respond. Compliments from ghosts meant little. Finally, Sabrina turned to face her fully. "I didn't come to make excuses." "Good," Elena said evenly. "I just needed to see you, to tell you something that's been sitting in my chest for a long time." Elena folded her arms, her posture calm but guarded. "Then say it." Sabrina took a breath. "Ryan and I are not together. We haven't been for months." Elena's expression didn't shift. "I assumed as much." "He's not the man I thought he was," Sabrina said quietly. "Maybe he never was." A bitter smile touched Elena's lips. "I could have told you that." "I know," Sabrina whispered, "but you wouldn't have. You had too much grace for that." The word grace lingered between them, heavy and tender at once. Elena said nothing. She didn't owe this woman her pain, nor her absolution. And yet, as she looked at Sabrina, this person who had once been the emblem of her betrayal, she felt something unexpected rising from the quiet center of her heart. Not anger, not pity, understanding. "What happened?" Elena asked softly. Sabrina laughed, a brittle sound. "He started doing to me what he did to you. The late nights, the lies, the quiet criticisms disguised as jokes. I thought I was special. I thought I could be the exception." Her eyes glistened. "But I was just next." Elena lowered her gaze for a moment, then met Sabrina's again. "I know what it's like to believe in the version of someone they sell you." Sabrina nodded, tears forming. "I'm sorry, Elena. Truly. I never meant to hurt you. I didn't understand then what it means to take part in someone else's silence." Elena studied her for a long time. The younger woman's mascara had smudged slightly beneath her eyes, her composure trembling at the edges. It was almost strange to see her like this, stripped of the glamour, the power, the illusion. "You did hurt me," Elena said quietly, "and for a long time I wanted to hate you. But hating you kept me tied to him, so I let it go." Sabrina's breath caught. "How?" "I stopped trying to win the story," Elena said. "I just rewrote it." They stood there, surrounded by the soft echo of their own fragility. Outside, the sound of traffic drifted faintly through the glass, the everyday hum of a city moving forward, indifferent to old wounds. Sabrina walked closer to one of the paintings, a piece called Resonance. Deep streaks of ochre and violet intertwined, fading into light. "This one," she whispered. "It feels like forgiveness." Elena's gaze softened. "Maybe that's what it is." When Sabrina turned back, her eyes were wet but steady. "You're stronger than he ever deserved." Elena tilted her head slightly. "So are you." Sabrina laughed through her tears. "I don't feel that way." "You will," Elena said. "When you stop defining yourself by what he saw in you." They fell silent again. It was an odd kind of stillness, not heavy, but whole. A pause that marked the end of something unnamed. After a long moment, Sabrina reached into her bag and pulled out a small envelope. "He asked me to give you this months ago. I couldn't, but I think you should have it now." Elena hesitated, then took it. The paper was creased from time, her name written in Ryan's neat, angular handwriting. She didn't open it right away. "Thank you," she said softly. Sabrina nodded. "Goodbye, Elena." As she turned to leave, Elena spoke again. Not out of habit, but out of something almost like mercy. "Sabrina," she said, and the woman paused at the door. "You don't have to carry his story anymore. It's not yours to hold." Sabrina's lips trembled into a faint smile. "Neither is it yours." And then she was gone. Elena stood in the golden light, the envelope still in her hand. For a long time she stared at it, weighing not the letter itself, but the ghost of expectation it contained. Eventually she opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, Ryan's handwriting spare and careful. "I don't know how to be the man you deserved. I thought control was love. I thought admiration was connection. I see now that I never really knew you, not because you were hidden, but because I never stopped looking at myself. I'm sorry, not for losing you, I earned that, but for how I made you feel small in the process." There was no signature, just a single initial, R. Elena folded the letter neatly and set it beside the painting Resonance. She didn't feel tears, She didn't feel rage. What she felt was release, the soft, clean ache of something finished. That night, when Micah came by, he found her sitting by the window, the city aglow beneath them. "You look different," he said. "I think I am," she replied. He sat beside her. "What changed?" She handed him the envelope. "The last piece of a story I no longer belong to." Micah took her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "And what story do you belong to now?" Elena looked out at the skyline, its lights flickering like constellations rediscovering their shape. "One that's still being written," she said. And for the first time, the past felt like exactly what it was. Not a wound to revisit, but a door she had finally walked through. The first heat of summer came early that year, rolling through Chicago like a slow, relentless tide. The air shimmered against the streets, thick with the hum of cicadas and the scent of asphalt warming under the sun. In Bronzeville, life spilled onto the sidewalks, open windows, laughter from porches, music weaving through the trees. For Elena, the season felt like a mirror. Everything inside her was shifting too, not toward chaos, but towards something fierce and alive. It began quietly, the way most transformations do, a restlessness beneath the calm, a spark she could feel in her chest whenever she stood before a blank canvas, brush in hand. Her work had changed again. The colors she once used, muted, graceful, restrained, no longer felt like her language. Now, the hues came bold and unapologetic. Copper, scarlet, deep emerald, strokes that moved like breath and pulse. Each painting carried a kind of fever. Each one demanded truth. Micah noticed it first. He'd arrived one afternoon, camera slung over his shoulder as always, to find her barefoot and covered in paint, the air in the apartment heavy with the scent of turpentine and sunlight. "Something's different," he said softly, watching her work. Elena didn't look up. "Everything's different," he smiled. "It looks like you're on fire." She paused, lowering the brush. "Maybe I am." He stepped closer, studying the canvas. It was unlike anything she'd done before. A surge of color that seemed to move even in stillness, an unfiltered confession made visible. "What are you painting?" "The feeling of standing in your own skin and not apologizing for it," she said. Micah's gaze lingered on her, admiration threaded with something deeper. "Then don't stop." But fire, she knew, was not just warmth, it was risk. And with every painting, every moment of boldness, came an undercurrent of fear. How much of herself could she reveal before the past reached for her again? She began waking before dawn, unable to sleep. The city was quiet then, its heartbeat slow and steady, and she would sit by the window watching the light rise, that first blush of orange spreading across the lake. She found herself thinking about all the versions of herself she'd had to burn to become this one. The obedient wife, the careful artist, the woman who measured her worth by someone else's reflection. Each had gone to ash, leaving behind something raw but real. One morning, she went for a walk through the neighborhood. The heat had not yet arrived, and the air was soft, touched by the scent of rain that hadn't fallen. She stopped at the mural she and Micah had painted months before, the hands reaching toward light, now weathered but still vivid. Someone had added words beneath it in spray paint. "We rise by remembering who we are." Elena smiled. She didn't know who had written it, but it felt like an answer to a question she hadn't realized she'd been asking. That afternoon, she returned to her studio with renewed clarity. The painting she'd been struggling with, a massive canvas she'd left untouched for days, now called to her. She picked up her brush, and for hours she painted without pause. The strokes came fast, wild, guided by instinct rather than plan. The music playing in the background blurred into rhythm. Sweat trickled down her neck, and lights shifted across the walls, golden and alive. When she finally stepped back, her breath came uneven. The canvas before her was nothing like what she'd imagined. It was raw, turbulent, almost violent in its honesty. It wasn't beautiful. It was true. She titled it, "The Fire Inside." That evening, Micah returned. He stopped when he saw the painting, his eyes tracing the movement, the chaos, the pulse of color that seemed to hum in the still air. "It's alive," he murmured. Elena nodded, her hands still stained red and gold. "So am I." He turned to her then, his expression softer than she'd ever seen it. "You've been waiting a long time for this, haven't you?" She smiled faintly. All my life. They stood side by side, the room lit only by the fading sun through the windows. Outside, the city's hum deepened, the world shifting toward evening. Micah reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. His fingers left a faint trace of paint on her skin, a mark that looked accidental, but felt deliberate. The smallest gesture of connection, grounded and real. "Do you ever think about him?" he asked quietly. "Ryan?" she said, considering. "Sometimes, but not with pain. More like remembering a dream that once felt real. I don't hate him anymore." Micah nodded. "That's how you know it's over." She turned to face him fully. "And how do you know when something new has begun?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at her, really looked, the way someone might look at a horizon just before sunrise. When you stop asking permission to feel it. Something in her chest stirred, deep and steady. He reached for her hand, hesitated, and then took it. His touch was warm, familiar, but it carried weight. The quiet gravity of two people who had been broken and rebuilt enough times to understand what it meant to hold gently. They didn't kiss, not then. They didn't need to. The space between them was already alight with unspoken understanding. That night, after he left, Elena stood before the fire inside again. She traced the edges of the brushstrokes, the rise and fall of color. It was not just a painting. It was her story, translated into form. Every scar, every choice, every moment she had chosen herself over silence. She thought of the flame that had nearly destroyed her, the one she'd carried too long in the shadows of someone else's world. Now that same fire was hers to command. It didn't burn her anymore. It illuminated her. As she turned off the lights, the last glow of sunset reflected off the painting's surface, making it seem alive, breathing, pulsing, refusing to fade. And for the first time, Elena didn't fear what came next, because the fire inside her was no longer something to tame. It was something to live by. Summer gave way to autumn like an exhale, slow, golden, inevitable. The air softened, the light grew honey-warm, and the days lingered as though reluctant to leave. In Bronzeville, the trees turned shades of copper and flame, their reflections trembling in puddles after brief rains. The world was in transition, and so was she. Elena had grown used to the rhythm of her life now, mornings steeped in quiet creation, afternoons filled with laughter from the children at the art center, evenings spent walking the streets with her sketchbook tucked under her arm. The city had ceased to feel like something she lived in. It had become something that lived in her. Her work had blossomed into something fierce and tender all at once. Critics called her latest collection The Fire Inside and Other Truths, but she preferred to think of it simply as her diary in color. Each piece bore the mark of a woman who had once been broken and had chosen, deliberately, not to stay that way. And then one evening, when the sky was painted in violet and gold, she stood in her gallery once more, her gallery now, not anyone else's, surrounded by the people who had come to witness what she'd built from the ashes. The walls pulsed with her art, her story written in pigment and light. Tessa was there, radiant and proud. Micah, quiet and steady, lingered near the back, camera in hand, his eyes never straying far from her. Even Ryan had sent a message that morning, brief, polite, final. "I'm happy for you, truly. You became everything I wasn't brave enough to see." Elena had read it once, then deleted it. She didn't need his acknowledgement anymore. The validation she once sought had long since turned into something purer. The deep, unwavering knowledge that her voice was enough. She took the small stage at the center of the room. Her dress was simple. Linen, the color of warm sand. Her hair unpinned. Her presence unguarded. She didn't have a speech prepared. She didn't need one. "When I first began painting again," she said, her voice carrying through the hush of the room, "I thought I was trying to recover what I'd lost. My confidence, my marriage, my sense of worth." She smiled, soft and sure. "But what I learned is that you can't recover what was never truly yours. You can only become what you were meant to be before the world taught you to shrink." A murmur moved through the crowd. Not applause, but resonance. The kind of silence that means listening. "I used to think becoming was a destination," she continued. "That once I healed enough, worked enough, loved enough, I'd arrive somewhere. Some perfect version of myself that would finally be whole. But the truth is, becoming never ends. It's a living thing, a movement, a fire you keep feeding. Her gaze found Micah's then. He wasn't smiling. He didn't need to. His eyes held the kind of pride that didn't demand to be seen, only felt. This collection, she said, gesturing toward the paintings, is not about survival. It's about resurrection. It's about learning that you can burn down what was and still walk out of the flames with your heart intact. Applause broke out, gentle at first, then swelling, filling the room like warmth spilling over. She bowed her head slightly, humbled but unshaken. When it faded, she stepped down from the stage, weaving through the crowd until she reached Micah. "You didn't tell me there'd be a speech," he murmured. She smiled. "Neither did I." He laughed quietly, then took her hand, his thumb brushing the faint trace of paint still on her skin. "You're glowing." "That's not glow," she said softly. "That's fire." They stayed until the last of the guests drifted out, until the gallery was empty except for the two of them and the quiet hum of the city beyond the glass. The lights reflected off her paintings, casting dancing colors across the walls. Reds and golds and soft, forgiving blues. Micah walked her to the center of the room, where the fire inside hung like a heart, alive and eternal. "What's next?" he asked. Elena looked at the painting, at the brush strokes that told her story without words. "Next," she repeated, "I live." Outside, the night wind pressed gently against the windows, carrying with it the scent of rain and faraway music. The world felt vast again, like it had when she was young. Not because it was easy, but because it was open. Later, on the balcony of her apartment, she stood barefoot, watching the city lights shimmer like stars that had chosen to fall closer to the earth. She could feel the faint warmth of Micah's presence inside, the steady rhythm of a life that no longer frightened her. The fire inside her no longer demanded to consume. It illuminated, steady, enduring, quiet in its power. She realized then every version of herself, the woman who had endured, the one who had burned, the one who had risen, had led her here, to this simplicity, to this strength. Becoming wasn't about transformation. Not really. It was about remembrance, the art of returning to oneself. She closed her eyes and let the wind move through her hair, her skin humming with gratitude. Somewhere deep in the night, she could hear the city breathing, could feel her own pulse matching its rhythm. Elena Brooks, survivor, artist, woman, smiled into the dark. Not because her story was over, but because she finally understood that it never would be. She had become, and she was still becoming. If her story found its way into your heart, if you felt her quiet fire, her strength, her awakening, stay with her journey. There are more stories like hers waiting to be told, more hearts remembering their own rhythm. Because somewhere, right now, another soul is standing before their own blank canvas, trembling, uncertain, but ready to begin again. And maybe, just maybe, that soul is you.